Welcome, and many thanks for tuning in. This is Adam Gamoran, president of the William T. Grant Foundation. Today, I'm joined by D. Max Crowley, associate professor of human development and family studies at Penn State University, and Itzhak Yanovitzky, professor of communications at Rutgers University. Also present are Lenore Nair and Billy Hunter from our communications team, and Vicente Malave, who can assist with technology needs. Today's webinar focuses on studying ways to improve the use of research evidence, with particular attention to developing and testing robust strategies to get evidence used in public policy. Before we get started, I want to share a few logistics. First, you can hear us, but we can't hear you, and you can't hear one another. Still, you are welcome to post questions through the question inbox within GoToWebinar. There will be 2 occasions during the presentation where we will pause and respond to as many of the questions that we can. But due to time constraints, we won't be able to answer all the questions during the webinar. We'll answer as many directly as we can through the question box. And in addition, we may feed some of these into frequently asked questions in the future. And we may follow up with you after the webinar if needed. In addition, the slides and audio from the webinar will be posted within a week or so. Now, what is our plan for today? Well, the webinar has 3 parts. In the first part, I will talk about the William T. Grant Foundation, and in particular about our program to support research on improving the use of research evidence in policy and practice decisions that affect young people. In the second part, we will have our 2 panelists, each presenting an example of research on a robust strategy to get evidence used. We'll first hear from Max Crowley, and then second, we'll hear from Itzhak Yanovitzky. Then we will pause for questions. In part 3 of the webinar, I will tell you how to pursue a research grant from the William T. Grant Foundation, and then we'll have another period for questions for all of us. As a reminder, submit your questions through the question box in GoToWebinar at any time during the presentation. The William T. Grant Foundation was founded in 1936 by William T. Grant. Through its long history, it's been committed to understanding human behavior through social science research. But the specific interests of the foundation have shifted over time to focus on the most pressing challenges confronting young people of the day. The foundation is committed to supporting high-quality research. Today, we have 2 focus areas. One is on reducing inequality. This is a line of funding to understand how programs, policies, and practices reduce inequality among young people in the United States. Now, there's a lot of research on the extent and sources of inequality, but our funding program focuses on responses to inequality. What can we do to reduce inequality in youth outcomes? Our second area of focus is improving the use of research evidence. Here, we wish to understand how to create conditions that improve the production and use of research evidence in ways that benefit youth. Here, we're focusing not on what are the barriers to getting evidence used. We already know that it's often not timely, relevant, and accessible, and that needs to be improved. What we'd like to know is how to improve the way evidence is used in policy and practice. For both of our focus areas, the target is youth ages 5 to 25 in the United States. In our focus on the use of research evidence, although many individuals are using research to inform policy practice, we need more systematic studies of these efforts to better understand what it takes to get research used. We have prioritized 3 lines of inquiry to move us closer to this goal. These 3 lines of inquiry include, first, studies to identify and test strategies to improve the use of research evidence. Second, studies to identify and test strategies for producing more useful evidence that ultimately gets used. And third, we'd like research that tests an assumption that many of us researchers carry around, which is that if only decision makers would have their decisions informed by research, those decisions would work out better for youth. But that's an assumption, and we invite research to test that assumption. Today, our webinar focuses on the first of these lines of research, studies to identify and test strategies to improve the use of research. Now, what do I mean by use of research? Well, sometimes we're talking about research that can inform a decision. For example, I need to implement a new program. What should I do? Let's consult the research. Aha, informed by the research, I'm better positioned to make this decision. But the use of research can be more subtle and shape ideas. This is known as conceptual use. Some research suggests that conceptual use of research seeps into discussions or may be evident when decision makers attend to ideas. Conceptual use doesn't inform just one decision, but rather it influences what we prioritize and focus on as evidence. So conceptual use of research can help decision makers understand the problem more deeply or identify a range of solutions rather than pointing towards one decision or another. We are interested in supporting research that helps improve both instrumental and conceptual use of research evidence. And what do we mean by a robust strategy to get evidence used? By a robust strategy, we mean a systematic approach to infuse evidence into the routine work of policymakers. A robust strategy must be potent enough to make evidence visible and understood. But a robust strategy may take many different forms. It could be a tool that policymakers use to support their work. It could be a structured process that policymakers follow so that evidence informs their decision making. It may capitalize on existing structures or build new ones. A robust strategy should be based on prior theory and evidence about the use of research evidence and should reflect deep understanding of the context in which evidence may be used. Today, we're showcasing two examples of existing grants we have awarded that focus on developing and testing strategies to improve the use of research evidence. Both are in the domain of public policy. One is at the federal level, and the other is at the state level. One is an impact study using methods that test cause and effect. The other is an implementation study that examines what is working, where, and why. Both of these studies show how to infuse research evidence into the everyday routines of policymakers. Our two speakers are Max Crowley, Associate Professor of Human Development and Family Studies and Director of the Evidence to Impact Collaborative at Penn State University, and Itzhak Yanovitzky, Professor of Communications at Rutgers University. We will hear first from Max on his research on testing a robust strategy to get evidence used. Max, over to you.
Thanks, Adam. Really appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today to share our work with the foundation. So as Adam mentioned, I'm going to be talking about an impact evaluation that we've been conducting through the support of the foundation on the research to policy collaboration model. This is a partnership with Child Trends and the London School of Tropical Medicine. And we're really excited to share the approach that we took as a way that may inform your efforts to field proposals to the foundation. So real quick, as an overview, what I'm going to talk briefly about is the research to policy collaboration model. So as Adam mentioned, there's many different ways to think about how do we improve the use of research evidence. And so we developed a specific model that takes different aspects and different points of view and work that's come before us and builds on that and brings that together in an effort to improve research evidence. I'll talk a little about that. I'll then talk about the current evaluation in an effort to sort of showcase what can be done and when you seek to evaluate and really determine if the strategy may work or may not work, or to what extent it works. And then finally, I have a couple suggestions that can be used for improving your URE proposal. So briefly, Adam gave a nice overview of kind of how the foundation and the field, the use of research evidence field, conceptualizes use of research evidence. And in particular, our effort sought to kind of to think about how do we improve the use of research evidence, in particular when there's some thorny issues that need to be addressed, right? So the need for dissemination of research evidence is necessary, but often insufficient, especially the ways that we often traditionally have conceptualized disseminating research, especially to policymakers and decision makers. And in particular, we capitalize on the importance of interactions, recognizing that relationships are crucial to facilitating this process, but that those relationships also exist within fast-moving policy windows, and that the research itself must be both timely and relevant. And ultimately, for the use of research evidence to be enhanced, that we believe that current theory and evidence has really supported the need overall for collaboration. So this background led us to the development of the research to policy collaboration model. And so I'm going to briefly first talk about our theory of change. And as you think about what not only work in this area, but a proposal to the foundation, I can't emphasize enough the importance of really thinking through your theory of change. And you'll see later as I talk about the evaluation, why that theory of change in particular is so important. So the RPC model really works on a parallel structure, and recognizing the importance of understanding policy opportunities and connecting those with relevant translational research. But also, while there's the focus on the policy domain, that the researchers themselves have an important role to play, right? Because of that relational aspect. So the need to recognize and at times enhance researchers' own policy competencies, right? Many of us are trained as scientists, as researchers. We're not necessarily trained to work in the policy space, and that's appropriate for much of our daily tasks. But when we want to start thinking about how do we bring what we consider two separate communities together, we recognize the need for researchers who do serve that bridging role. So policymakers and researchers, then we seek to bring them together in collaboration. That collaboration really hinges on the need for trusting relationships. And so our ultimate theory of change then leads through those relationships, we see an improvement in the use of research evidence. So briefly, this is the more concrete model itself, so the actual steps of the research to policy collaboration. So you'll see that during the capacity building phase, two parallel processes, one that engages the legislative community, one that engages the research community. The first step being the identification of policy itself, and then and then the second step, working with the research community to bring researchers together who have expertise around that policy issue, and then building their capacity to actually to work with the policy audiences, and then again iterating and doing formal needs assessments to understand short-term needs. Then we have the opportunity to move into the collaboration phase, where we bring those researchers and policymakers together, sometimes in person, sometimes virtually, and then from there we have the opportunity to work then with those dyads or triads or groups even of researchers and policymakers together around strategic planning, and then ultimately a rapid response process. And that's where things really heat up and the work really iterates. So one of the things that we felt like was essential before, for instance, seeking funding from the foundation, was to do some pilot work with with this model. And we fielded a pilot working with congressional offices and a number of different researchers. We, in particular here, you can see, for instance, some of the legislative requests that were elicited through this process and then responded to through this model. So reviewing intervention strategies, ideologic evidence. So lots of different areas where there was an opportunity to support the use of research evidence. And then importantly, we sought to publish on it, right? So really seeking to build the literature around in the URE space and sort of thinking about the science of how we use science. One thing that was particularly important for us in the pilot work that really helped us lead to a successful proposal was not just thinking about, of course, our outcomes, but thinking deeply about the sustainability of such initiatives, right? What resources are actually out there to support this type of effort to improve the use of research evidence? In the same way that we need to think about sustainability of many of our different social science and health related interventions, can they actually operate in the place that we intend them to do? Will the resources be there? We thought about what were the resources that were going to be required for implementation. And so by doing that deep formative work, we felt like we were able to field a better proposal because we could speak to what was needed at what time by who. So we then proposed an evaluation to the foundation, and in particular, we wanted to know, does the RPC actually impact researchers and legislative staff, right? Does it actually improve the use of research evidence? Will the congressional offices, so we were in particular focusing on the US Congress at that time, increase their use of research evidence in legislative activities? And then also, how might the perceptions and experiences of collaboration through the RPC relate to different forms of evidence use among researchers and policymakers? So that really sought to get to the heart of both that instrumental and conceptual use, but also avoiding types of research evidence use like tactical use that we think at times might actually not lead to the positive outcomes that we're seeking. So one thing in particular, as you think about how you're going to proceed here, is to be very structured in your work. And in particular, we felt like we had the opportunity to bring a bit of experimentation to this work. We actually sought to and have randomized congressional offices as well as researchers who are participating in the study, and then collect iterative, longitudinal, if you will, assessments. And by doing so, we sought to build not only a robust understanding of what was happening on the ground, but then have the ability to potentially draw some stronger causal inferences or near causal inferences about whether or not the RPC was actually impacting those outcomes, especially in a space that can be as messy as policy settings. So in particular, one thing that I often will recommend to folks who are thinking about work in this space, either expanding existing work or moving into a new area, is how much we don't know. And that's okay. And this is one of the nice things about working with the foundation is we're encouraged to think about what we don't know and how to address that. So we found that a mixed methods evaluation that really allowed us the ability to think strategically a priori about what we wanted to assess, but also capture things as they occurred, right? Was really important. In particular, so we had quantitative surveys, both for researchers, legislators, as well as of the collaborative relationship itself, as well as more qualitative assessment, as well as a collection of administrative data, public and otherwise, that allowed us to kind of have 3 different areas of data coming in an effort to build convergent evidence in this space. And that's really important, is thinking about how do we build robust evidence of our ability to improve research evidence use. Okay, so a couple things I just wanted to leave you all with in particular is, in terms of suggestions for your own proposals, is the importance of considering a strategy that's sustainable from the beginning. So it's easy to build a Cadillac version, especially in the face of concerns that research evidence isn't being used in some domains, and throw in everything but the kitchen sink, or maybe the kitchen sink as well. But it is important to think about sustainability because we want to develop tools, we want to develop practices, we want to develop approaches that are going to be sustainable and disseminable, and learn from other fields that have had sustainability issues. And so that's really important. I encourage that. The importance of looking for convergent evidence, as I mentioned before, to build your evidence base, both as you go into the proposal, if you can, and as well as within the proposal itself. Mapping the measurement back onto your theory of change. So as you mentioned, as you might have seen there, some of our measures in particular seek to speak to different aspects or different processes with that theory of change. And then also striving for opportunities to strengthen your ability to draw or make some sort of causal inference. It's not always possible to do kind of robust experimentation. That's totally a realistic problem that you'll face when doing research in this space and proposing research in this space. But sometimes within, there is the opportunity to, for instance, leverage some existing randomization because of the need to serve many different stakeholders, or some other sort of subtype of randomization or experimentation. And if it's possible, if it presents, if the opportunity presents, I highly encourage it, because this is certainly what this field, one of the areas where this field can grow. Thank you, Adam.
Max, thank you so much for those remarks. And as we transition to our second example of a robust strategy to use research evidence, I want to remind people that they can use the question box to ask questions, and we will field those questions after our second speaker. Max's example provided a study that is testing the impact of a robust strategy to use evidence. Our second speaker, Itzhak Yanovitzky from Rutgers University, will provide an example of a study that's examining the implementation of a robust strategy to use research evidence. And whereas Max's study was focused at the federal level, Itzhak's study is focused at the state level. Itzhak, over to you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you all for joining us today. In these photos taken pre-COVID, you can see our whole entire research team and advisory board. So I want to very quickly acknowledge my co-PIs on this project, Matt Weber from the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. Cindy Blitz is a research professor and executive director of the Rutgers Graduate School of Education Center for Effective School Practices. And we have Brian Shu from the Rutgers Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. We also have, as research partners on this project, a National Alliance of Mental Illness New Jersey, or NAMI New Jersey, Meredith Blount and Maggie Lowe, who is a research partners on this project, as well as our very talented, highly talented graduate students who work on this project, and our advisory board members. As the title of my presentation suggests, our focus on this project is on evidence in the context of state policymaking. We chose to focus on this level of policymaking for three reasons. First, state and local policies have direct impact on behaviors and conditions, so that's important to study that. Unlike federal policymaking, who have the resources to access and commission policy relevant research, for example, the Congressional Research Service, state policymakers, and by that I mean legislators, elected officials, and government agency staff, do not have the resources or mechanisms to obtain research, so we need to build the capacity to do so. And then finally, there's been a lot of interest in research in federal policymaking on the national level. There's much less research on state policymaking, and we were very interested to compare what we find at the state level to finding of research we got from the first round of project for William T. funded focus on the federal level. Next slide, please. So let me start by describing our approach a little bit. Max already spoke about the problem of dissemination. What I want to reiterate here is the fact that when you approach the problem from a pure dissemination perspective, you're assuming a deficit model. That is, that relevant body of research that inform policy already exists, and therefore all we need to do is to make sure it gets in front of policymakers. The problem I want to suggest with this line of thinking is that it is evidence-focused. It is focused on what evidence we think policymakers should use, as opposed to user audience focus, which is what policymakers actually need or want to know and how motivated they are to use it. So the goal is not to expose policymakers to research, but rather engage them, make sure that they understand why research is relevant and important, and motivate them to use it. So how do we do that? So you see here what I call the 3 R's of robust strategies for improving URE, and we know that from the literature. The first R is for being responsive to policymakers' information needs, preferences, and motivations. For example, we learned in a previous project that policymakers frequently look for research that can inform implementations of policies, how to do it. But most of the time, the only thing that's available to them from research are prescriptions or guidelines in terms of what to do. We also learned that policymakers often use research evidence to persuade others. So research evidence that is authoritative, for example, statistical facts or research from a reputable source, is highly valued. The second R stands for routines, and Anna mentioned that. In general, use of research evidence can be improved when it is integrated or infused into existing routines. As scientists, we have well-formed routines regarding acquisition, interpretation, use of research evidence, but we cannot expect users, including policymakers, to do the same. So we must respect and study their routines to figure where's the best way to put the intervention in and improve use of research evidence. For example, we found that research has a higher likelihood of being used when policymakers experience a higher level of uncertainty regarding policy. That's when a window open to provide research. When they're sure about what the right policy is, they tend to use research that supports the conclusion. In other words, they're doing what we call tactical or political use of research. The third R here, which is very important, is relationships. Research does not speak for itself. Someone has to bring relevant research to the attention of policymakers, make sure they comprehend it and understand its relevance and value to informing their decisions, and push them or nudge them to act on this knowledge. This is easier to accomplish when you already have relationships with policymakers, relationships that are grounded in trust and mutual respect, but also interdependence. So robust strategies are those that seek to build relationship with policymakers, or in our case, seek to leverage existing relationships. Our intervention is focused on knowledge brokering. So for those who don't know, let me give a bit of a background about that. So we believe that knowledge brokering match or fit all of these three R's for robust strategies, because knowledge brokers are those key intermediaries who facilitate the flow of knowledge between parties, and therefore play an important role in regulating the flow and exchange of research evidence among producers and users. Now, because knowledge brokers already have relationship with users, because they are routinely interacting with users, and because they are responsive to their needs, they meet that requirements for robust intervention. Now, some of the literature on this topic define brokers based on their position within the network that connects researchers and users. For example, because many people are exposed to research via news coverage of issues, news media are positioned to broker research to a diverse group of audiences. Our own approach, however, is focused less on position and more on brokering activity. That is, the fact that an actor is positioned to broker does not mean they actually do that. For example, when they don't have incentive to broker research. Ultimately, it is what broker does that counts. So we developed a theoretical model, and you can find that reference in that webinar resources to a piece that has a theory in it. And we identify 5 crucial functions or activities that knowledge brokers perform to connect users with relevant research. We talk about awareness, drawing attention to relevant research, accessibility, making research more accessible and comprehensible to decision makers, engagement, influencing decision makers to consider the value of research-based insights, linkage, making connections to other actors or issues, and mobilization, again, pushing policymakers to act. Now, this brings us to the big idea behind this project. There are many actors who potentially could broker research to policymakers, but we are interested in those brokers that are already actively performing these functions because we understand they're going to be more effective. So who are the actors that are well positioned to do this? And we determined that in the context of health policymaking, patient advocacy organizations are well positioned to do this because they have credibility, they have existing relationship with policymakers, they have the resources and organizational capacity to broker research, they have operations and missions that already target policy change in terms of the advocacy effort, and they're highly visible to the public, so they are in a position to influence political and public discourse on the topic. I want to add that in the current political environment, it's also important to be a nonpartisan actor, and that can be helpful in terms of introducing research and using research. Importantly, because they are well connected to the research community as well, some of them actually are sponsoring research, PAOs are already positioned to communicate back science feedback from policymakers. So they allow us to listen to what policymakers need and really enhance our ability to improve use of research evidence. So the big idea is to focus on these organizations and build their capacity to broker the research that policymakers need to make decisions. Next slide, please. Let me talk about the specific problem we're addressing in this project. So as I mentioned, the frequent problem we encounter is that translational science efforts end up with a consensus reports or guidelines. In other words, we tell policymakers what to do. But we stop short of providing guidance regarding implementation of proposed policies. We don't tell them how to do it. Without this information, policymakers are hesitant about implementing policy. In our case, many states, New Jersey included, made a decision to adopt the U.S. Task Force evidence-based recommendations to conduct routine screening for depression in youth aged 12 to 18 years old in schools. But legislation is stalled because of lingering concerns about feasibility, cost, and potential unintended effects. In fact, the bill to mandate screening per the guidelines passed both houses in New Jersey, but was vetoed down by the governor this past January because these concerns were not addressed. So things are stuck until policymakers have more clarity regarding the potential for this policy to be a good thing all around. Next slide, please. So the problem we face is that the kinds of research state policymakers are looking for does not actually exist. For example, they wonder how will parents respond to this mandate? Can schools handle universal screening? What happens when the test detect depression? What do you do with the results of the test? Is it possible that screening will be used to stigmatize students from minority population? All of these are really good questions that we don't have any answer to. So what we are proposing to do in this project is to conduct this research, collect this information, make it available to our research partner, NAMI New Jersey, and more broadly to policymakers and to youth mental health community to increase the likelihood that sound research is guiding these policy decisions. The important piece to emphasize here is that there is the co-design process. There's a lot we can learn from NAMI New Jersey and other professionals about effective brokering of research evidence that is missing from the literature on this topic. So in the spirit of knowledge brokering, our goal is to bring this knowledge to the attention of researchers as foundation to scaling up intervention. The other important piece here is about building the capacity to communicate research more effectively to policymakers based on what we know from science communication. This is why we start with an audit of the dissemination engagement strategies of NAMI New Jersey, the strategies already employed, and we seek opportunities to build and enhance new capacities via training and tools. Next slide, please. So here's a basic outline of the project. This is not a logic model or a theory of action per se. The logic model comes, as I mentioned, from our theory of knowledge brokering that you can find in the resources, but this provides you some sort of an overview of the plan activities. You can also see for the first time what ASPEN stands for, Active Surveillance of Policy Ecosystems and Networks. Note that the emphasis is on conducting environmental scan and producing a range of research outputs from tracking health indicators and legislative activity, periodically assessing public opinion data and degree of support and opposition from stakeholders, and even recommendations regarding screening procedures in schools, all of which can provide important clues regarding the feasibility of implementing the evidence-based guidelines. As I mentioned, the idea is to make this information available via a knowledge portal that we are actually building and pre-testing this year, but also experiment with different products and tools that we have to see which ones are the ones that get more traction with different group of users. You can also see what will be included in the training we provide to NAMI staffers and selected group of knowledge brokers we identify. And we want to be able to train them to do a better job in terms of science communication, audience segmentation, branding, facilitations. All this is very important to increase engagement with research that we are pursuing. And next slide, please. Here's a rough outline of our evaluation plan. Okay, so recall that our focus is on improving use of research evidence in the context of policy implementation. So this is the moving target. And we plan for the possibility that if the legislation is passed, the relevant group of users will shift from legislator to the state of New Jersey agencies that are responsible for implementation. So it's really important to build in some flexibility into the design without compromising any rigor. Also, unlike the project that Max described, an RCT is not possible here because we have no way of randomizing the intervention to users. So the basic research design we're using for evaluation is a variation of an interrupted time series. So our process evaluation activities focus on two levels, the partner level and the ecosystem level. At the partner level involves tracking any changes in how our partner, NAMI New Jersey, is using research evidence in the context of their advocacy and outreach efforts. I'm not covering that here. I'm focusing here instead on the policy ecosystem level, where we continuously map and monitor the information about the topic of youth depression and suicide in New Jersey from multiple sources. So we're looking at policy documents, news and social media, position statements from stakeholders group, surveys and interviews with parents and school personnel. So we're looking at the whole information ecosystem and try to see what changes, if any, happen as a result of our activities. Our outcome evaluation is also using a mixed methods. We highly recommend using mixed methods. In addition, we're also going to use the website analytics to track who is using our product, who's retweeting products that we produce with the ASPEN brand. And so we can have a better command of what's going on. We're trying to track both the scope, nature, and timing of research evidence use and assess the extent to which it's making its way into policy to different kinds of pathways. So it's a different kind of design. Last slide. Finally, providing you some suggestion and tips about those of you applying. The first suggestion I'll make is that you need to focus your question on a URE-related problem. The question has to be relevant to improving use of research evidence, either the behavior or practice itself, or condition that can enable or motivate this practice. You can still propose to consider changes in actual policy, but this cannot be the primary motivation for this project. It has to be focused on use of research evidence. Second, it's important to situate your intervention in relation to the decision-making process you're actually targeting. The process of formulating policy is different than the process of implementing or evaluating policy. So you must respect the underlying process when you design the intervention. Third, you need to have a theory of action or logic model. Enough said. Lastly, be sure to define use in the context of a specific study. There is no single definition of use. You ought to approach it from the perspective of the user and their experience with using research evidence. We try to map evidence use routines. So make sure that you're measuring use and not measuring evidence, because use is what you're trying to target. With this, I'm going to thank you again for joining us today, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Itzhak and Max. And indeed, there are a number of questions. The first one is a really important question for the foundation, what we mean by a policymaker. And so thank you for this question. I want to emphasize that today's webinar showcases two examples where the user of research evidence is a legislative policymaker, either at the federal or the state level. But that's not the only user of research evidence that we're interested in. So sure, a policymaker can be an individual, or a decision maker can be a policymaker or a practitioner, which would include individuals in organizations like nonprofits, schools, museums, other contexts that make decisions that affect youth outcomes. So today's example focuses in the policy arena, but we're interested in a broader arena, as you'll see if you peruse the materials on our website. The next question is a question for Max. One listener asks whether your intervention occurred within a particular policy domain or a range of policy domains.
That's a great question. And so if we look at the process that we employ for the research policy collaboration model, in the same way that Itzhak mentioned, like, it's very important to listen to the decision maker audience that you're working with, in this case, federal policymakers. And in doing so, we allowed them to identify the area that not only the policy area of focus, but also the policy area of focus where they have particularly need of evidence. And so there's a bit of kind of this sort of partnership beginning at the beginning. And then from there, the model flows from working in that specific area. So researchers are coalesced into a network, and capacity is built within that network specific to that area. Now that area can be broad or smaller depending on the sort of size of that area and the need. But yes, it sort of starts with a specific policy area, and then the focus is there. That being said, and I think Itzhak might have something to say here as well, often after the first request, for instance, or we've worked and had a successful kind of collaboration, those policy areas can grow from there. So really at the center is the relationship, but the model flows from at first that first identification of a specific policy area, but it can be applied to many.
Thanks a lot, Max. I'm going to jump right back in here with another question because I want to get in as many questions as we can. This is a question for both of you. I'll start with Max and then move to Itzhak. And the question is, in your study, how are you measuring the policymakers' use of research evidence? Max?
It's a great question. So there's a couple different ways to do that. So we do rely we rely on a multimodal approach. That includes surveyed self-report of their use of research evidence, and the foundation actually has some measures that it's funded the development of in the past for that kind of survey work. We also look at their public comments, right? So we track public commentary, as well as we look at legislative language itself introduced by those policymakers. So that's another form. That's part of what we consider to be our administrative data. And then we also have a qualitative component. Particularly, we have an ethnography that's part of this work, and so we have an ethnographer actually working and interviewing those policymakers in parallel with us to try to understand their evidence use in a more qualitative fashion. So different ways, different approaches.
Thanks. Itzhak?
So we believe, and there's actually a paper in the webinar resources that it talks about how we measure use of research evidence. We actually believe that use of research evidence plays out in communication. So people communicate with research evidence, and the way they communicate with research evidence tells us about how they use it. So the fact, so to some extent, we look at policy documents and we look for references of research as much as you would look for citations. When you look at scientific papers, we don't think it's a good measure of use. We're trying to understand use in terms of conceptual use or instrumental use or political use. So we're looking at how the policymakers communicate about this evidence. So we have that track in an unobtrusive way. Again, looking at policy documents, the way it's appearing in news, social media, and some other ways. But we also conduct face-to-face interviews with policymakers, asking them more pointed questions to clarify what we see in terms of findings.
Thank you. Itzhak, how do you evaluate use when the context for use change across the settings you're studying?
So that's why flexibility is really important. And so part of that is to understand that many times when you deal with policy, there's a moving target, right? I mean, it could have been that that legislation would pass in January, that would be signed into law, and then now we're moving into a different phase, right, of policy making. So the use, again, we were approaching from the perspective of whether evidence is being used in a conceptual way. We believe that's a primary way in which evidence is being used in policy to really get understanding of the problem, understanding of the potential solutions. And we're also trying to see what people are referencing as almost like a thought listing type of thing, so tell me what evidence you use and how would that factor into your kind of schema. So even though these are two different contexts, in terms of implementation as opposed to legislation, the same principles apply in terms of what use is. So we try to be very consistent. However, because every measure is in context, we're very sensitive to the context in which use is defined, and that's the point I was trying to make.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And last question for Max. How do you think about recruiting policymakers to participate in the intervention?
It's a great question. And again, this is a very context-driven discussion so far, but it does depend. That being said, when we first started this work, we were very skeptical, and we were told by many, like, oh, you're going to run into a lot of problems, and in terms of recruitment. And the reality is that there are problems. There are offices, for instance, at the federal level, certainly in our own state work, and others certainly encounter this in other decision maker contexts where people don't want to feel like they're being told, something. And I think that's what's most important. As Itzhak said, there is a fundamental aspect of communication here. So we make the approach as, trying to help, but the more you listen, the better you understand what they want. And that process starts at the recruitment period, even sometimes in the research, which is something to think about strategically as you consider design. So I think that if you bring this relationship focus to your work, you'll have greater success often in many cases. And that would be the kind of main suggestion, but there's others as well, right? There's cultural aspects that you often need to understand. It's good to bring in, insiders to consult on this type of work when, for instance, putting together a research project, those type of things.
Thank you very much to both of you for answering those excellent questions from listeners. Now I'm going to talk for a few minutes about responding to our call for applications and tell you how to get our money. And then we'll have a few more minutes at the end for additional questions. So keep those questions coming in the question box. The William T. Grant Foundation supports research projects directed towards our two focus areas. We have Officers Research Awards, which are $50,000 or less, and major research grants, which generally range from $100,000 to $600,000, although for intervention studies in the use of research evidence field, we do go up to $1 million. Now, major research grants have a two-phase process for application, starting with a letter of inquiry. The deadlines for letters of inquiry are in January, May, and August. Within 6 to 8 weeks, applicants will receive an answer as to whether their letter of inquiry is invited for a full proposal. About 15% of the letters of inquiry receive invitations for full proposals, and between a quarter and a third of the full proposals are ultimately funded. The letters of inquiries are reviewed for their fit with our current interests and funding criteria. If a full proposal is invited, it then goes out for external review. The external reviews are then examined internally, and the most favorably reviewed proposals go back to the investigators with an opportunity to respond to the critiques. And then the strongest responses are then recommended to our Board of Trustees, which meet 3 times a year for decisions over proposals in October, March, and June. Officers' research applications are accepted only twice a year in August and January, and it's through the same process where the letters of inquiries go in. I want to give you a few suggestions on proposing research on the use of research evidence. First of all, it's really important to richly conceptualize what you mean by the use of research evidence. Second, to offer an operational definition of research use. How will you know it when you see it? Third, to provide details about the methods and analyses you will use to assess the use of research evidence. And fourth, ensure that your team has the methodological expertise to do this work. A few tips. Lead with the research activities. That is the core of our funding, and that should be the core of your applications. Prioritize the research activities, lead with the questions, and offer hypotheses. Second, ground the study in prior work. There is an emerging literature to which our grantees have contributed and others have contributed. Study this literature and engage with the different traditions and approaches for studying knowledge brokering, use of research evidence, translation, etc. Third, closely align the research questions and the study methods. We do not privilege any particular research method. Rather, we look to see that the method is appropriate for the design, for the question that is being asked. Last, demonstrate how the study adds value. What will we know at the end of this study that we did not previously know? How does this work push forward the field, both for the research literature and for policy and practice? We have a wealth of resources on our website, including an application guide, a blog post on methods, blog posts for tips, writings by our staff and grantees. We have frequently answered questions. We have sample proposals. All of these are of great value. You'll see many of them listed in the webinar resources documents in the handout box of this webinar. And I especially want to call your attention to a new resource, a monograph on studying the use of research evidence. Presentations you heard today are referenced in there as examples of methodological approaches to studying the use of research evidence, along with many other approaches. I strongly encourage you to get information about methods from this resource. Okay, that is the end of our formal presentation, and I will turn once again to the questions box and see if there are questions for me or for any of our presenters. So keep those questions flowing. Yes, question for both presenters. Could you say more about, so I asked you previously to comment on how the use of research evidence is measured. Now, could you say something about how dissemination or engagement with policymakers is measured? How are you measuring the extent of knowledge flow from the research to the policy or practitioner? Why don't we start with Itzhak on this one and then go to Max?
So the dissemination, is generally has to do with outreach efforts. So, we can look at what's being done, what is the research. So think about, if I have a piece of research that would go with ASPEN, I may use Twitter to disseminate that. So I'm pushing that information out and I'm seeing what the uptake is how many people are retweeting it, or how many people are using it or referencing that. That does not suggest necessarily engagement. Engagement is a much higher level. I want to see some sort of an evidence that that piece of evidence really informed the thinking of the policymaker or thinking of the user. And that's part of the reason why we're looking at the communication piece, because when we have a policymaker, for example, in the context of hearing, introducing a piece of research and discussing what the implications of this research is in terms of either problems or solutions, we have a better sense of how they engage with that research and how they use it. Are they using it in an instrumental way, conceptual way, or political way? Thank you. Max?
Yeah, I would definitely echo Itzhak's comments there in the importance in particular to think about different levels of reach, engagement, outreach, and thinking about that strategically as you make those connections and then trying to measure it. That could be everything from, you know, the most basic, like, can we get them to respond to an email, all the way through to really robust, you know, clearly conceptual or instrumental types of use. So I think that that's really important. In particular, a shout out to my partner in this, Taylor Scott, who, you know, has really emphasized and shown us organizationally the importance of keeping detailed narrative records of our engagement, because we've been able to go back over time and look at those to really understand that engagement through different frames. And the URE field is certainly evolving. We're continuing to bring kind of new ideas to it. And so having rich kind of qualitative operational data about your work is really going to be valuable as you move forward.
A question for the foundation about the external review process. A listener would like to know how we find the reviewers. And I can tell you that use of research evidence proposals that go out for external review generally go to 3 reviewers, and 2 are from the research field. And there's always one who's a policymaker or practitioner who understands deeply the context in which the research evidence is being used. That's a very important consideration for us. Another question regarding the application process, it is about decisions that result in a letter of inquiry being invited for a full proposal. If you go to the application guide, you'll see a list of criteria, and these are the criteria that we use to judge whether a letter of inquiry is appropriate for a full proposal. The first question is, does it fit with the funding area? In this case, use of research evidence. Improving the use of research evidence. Second then is are the methods that are proposed aligned with the research question? And third then, is it grounded in the previous literature? Is it building theory and evidence? Does it add value? But you'll see more details on this if you go to the application guide. Yes, we will be making the slides and audio available next week, so you can return to them and peruse them at your leisure, as well as share them with others. The foundation has been in the business of supporting research on improving the use of research evidence since 2009. And we've had several items on our website talking about what we've learned from this. I would particularly recommend, well, if you go to the focus area page for use of research evidence, you'll see a bunch of resources that our foundation staff have published taking stock of what we've learned. But I would particularly recommend an essay written by Kim Dumont about a year ago, former senior program officer at the foundation about a year ago, about the social side of evidence use. Her essay is about getting people in the evidence-based policy movement to use the evidence about using evidence. as not just a matter of coming up with good research findings and telling the world about it. It's not even just a matter of translation, of making those findings relevant, timely, and accessible. It's about the kind of deep, sustained work that Max and Itzhak have spoken about today, which involves engaging with policymakers, building relationships of trust, and working with them over time to get evidence use. So that's one of the resources that we have available, one of many. Okay, well, I want to thank Max Crowley and Itzhak Yanovitzky for speaking to our audience today. I want to thank all of the participants for participating in the webinar. Our next deadline for letters of inquiry is August 4th, and we look forward to receiving your letters. Thank you very much.